The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as General Morrison stepped out of his black sedan. His polished boots clicked against the concrete as he walked toward the main building, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of decades spent serving his country. Today was supposed to be a routine inspection of the new recruits, nothing more than checking their progress and ensuring military standards were being met. Sarah Chen stood in the back row of the formation, her uniform crisp and her posture straight. She had been at the base for 3 months now, learning everything from combat techniques to military protocol. Unlike the other recruits who seemed nervous about meeting the famous General Morrison, Sarah appeared calm, almost distant. Her dark eyes focused somewhere beyond the formation, as if her mind was occupied with thoughts far removed from the present moment. The drill sergeant barked orders as the general approached. "Attention! Present arms." The sound of synchronized movements filled the air as dozens of young soldiers snapped to attention and raised their hands in perfect salutes. The general walked slowly down the line, nodding approvingly at the crisp uniforms and disciplined stance of the recruits. But when he reached Sarah's position, something unexpected happened. While every other soldier maintained their salute, Sarah's hand remained at her side. She stood at attention, her back straight and her chin raised, but she did not salute. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing as everyone noticed the breach of military protocol. General Morrison stopped directly in front of her. His weathered face showed no emotion, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. In his 35 years of military service, he had never encountered such blatant disrespect from a recruit. The other soldiers in the formation began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the tension that was building in the air. "Soldier," the general said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. "You seem to have forgotten something." His pale blue eyes locked onto Sarah's dark ones, searching for any sign of fear or recognition of her mistake. But Sarah's expression remained unchanged, neither defiant nor apologetic. She simply looked back at him with a calm intensity that was both puzzling and unsettling. The drill sergeant stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Private Chen, salute the general immediately." His voice echoed across the training ground, causing several nearby soldiers to flinch, but Sarah did not move. She continued to stand at attention, her eyes never leaving the general's face. General Morrison raised his hand slightly, signaling the drill sergeant to step back. There was something about this young recruit that intrigued him. In all his years of command, he had dealt with rebellious soldiers, scared recruits, and everything in between. But this was different. Sarah wasn't displaying the typical signs of insubordination or fear. There was something else in her eyes, something that reminded him of another time, another place. "What's your name, soldier?" the general asked, though he already knew from the name tape on her uniform. "Private Sarah Chen, sir," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And why aren't you saluting me, Private Chen?" For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The entire formation held its breath, waiting for her response. The general could see something flickering behind her eyes, as if she was wrestling with a decision that went far beyond military protocol. The morning breeze rustled through the nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance, a flag snapped against its pole. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence that surrounded them, her words carried clearly to the general's ears. What she said next would change everything, not just for her military career, but for the general's understanding of his own past. The general's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale, and for a moment his composure cracked. His eyes widened with shock, and his hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as if trying to steady his suddenly racing heart. The name Sarah had whispered was one he hadn't heard in over 20 years, a name that was buried so deep in his past that he thought no one alive still remembered it. The drill sergeant noticed the general's reaction and started to move forward again. But Morrison held up his hand once more, this time more forcefully. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just heard and what it could possibly mean. How could this young recruit know that name? How could she know about something that happened so long ago, in a place so far from here? Sarah straightened back to attention, her brief moment of vulnerability replaced once again by that same calm intensity. She had taken an enormous risk by revealing what she knew, and now there was no going back. The secret she had carried for years was finally out in the open, and she could only wait to see how the general would react. The other recruits in the formation remained frozen, sensing that something significant was happening, but having no idea what it could be. They had expected to witness a simple disciplinary action, perhaps seeing their fellow recruit receive punishment for her disrespectful behavior. Instead, they found themselves witnessing something that felt much more personal and complex. General Morrison took a step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping so low that only she could hear him. "Where did you hear that name?" The question carried the weight of decades of buried memories and carefully guarded secrets. His hands, which had remained steady through countless battles and difficult decisions, began to tremble slightly. Sarah met his gaze directly, no longer the anonymous recruit in a sea of uniforms. "My grandmother told me about you," she said quietly. "She told me about David Liu." The name hit the general like a physical blow. David Liu. A name from a different life, a different war, a different version of himself that he thought he had left behind forever. Suddenly, he was no longer standing on a military base in the present day. He was back in the jungles of Vietnam, young and terrified, depending on the kindness of strangers to survive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as General Morrison stepped out of his black sedan. His polished boots clicked against the concrete as he walked toward the main building, his chest decorated with ribbons that told stories of decades spent serving his country. Today was supposed to be a routine inspection of the new recruits, nothing more than checking their progress and ensuring military standards were being met. Sarah Chen stood in the back row of the formation, her uniform crisp and her posture straight. She had been at the base for 3 months now, learning everything from combat techniques to military protocol. Unlike the other recruits who seemed nervous about meeting the famous General Morrison, Sarah appeared calm, almost distant. Her dark eyes focused somewhere beyond the formation, as if her mind was occupied with thoughts far removed from the present moment. The drill sergeant barked orders as the general approached. "Attention. Present arms." The sound of synchronized movements filled the air as dozens of young soldiers snapped to attention and raised their hands in perfect salutes. The general walked slowly down the line, nodding approvingly at the crisp uniforms and disciplined stance of the recruits. But when he reached Sarah's position, something unexpected happened. While every other soldier maintained their salute, Sarah's hand remained at her side. She stood at attention, her back straight and her chin raised, but she did not salute. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the birds seemed to stop singing as everyone noticed the breach of military protocol. General Morrison stopped directly in front of her. His weathered face showed no emotion, but those who knew him well could see the slight tightening around his eyes. In his 35 years of military service, he had never encountered such blatant disrespect from a recruit. The other soldiers in the formation began to shift uncomfortably, sensing the tension that was building in the air. "Soldier," the general said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority, "you seem to have forgotten something." His pale blue eyes locked onto Sarah's dark ones, searching for any sign of fear or recognition of her mistake. But Sarah's expression remained unchanged, neither defiant nor apologetic. She simply looked back at him with a calm intensity that was both puzzling and unsettling. The drill sergeant stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "Private Chen, salute the general immediately." His voice echoed across the training ground, causing several nearby soldiers to flinch. But Sarah did not move. She continued to stand at attention, her eyes never leaving the general's face. General Morrison raised his hand slightly, signaling the drill sergeant to step back. There was something about this young recruit that intrigued him. In all his years of command, he had dealt with rebellious soldiers, scared recruits, and everything in between. But this was different. Sarah wasn't displaying the typical signs of insubordination or fear. There was something else in her eyes, something that reminded him of another time, another place. "What's your name, soldier?" the general asked, though he already knew from the name tape on her uniform. "Private Sarah Chen, sir," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And why aren't you saluting me, Private Chen?" For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The entire formation held its breath, waiting for her response. The general could see something flickering behind her eyes, as if she was wrestling with a decision that went far beyond military protocol. The morning breeze rustled through the nearby trees, and somewhere in the distance a flag snapped against its pole. Finally, Sarah took a deep breath and leaned forward slightly. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence that surrounded them, her words carried clearly to the general's ears. What she said next would change everything, not just for her military career, but for the general's understanding of his own past. The general's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His face went pale, and for a moment his composure cracked. His eyes widened with shock, and his hand moved unconsciously to his chest as if trying to steady his suddenly racing heart. The name Sarah had whispered was one he hadn't heard in over 20 years. A name that was buried so deep in his past that he thought no one alive still remembered it. The drill sergeant noticed the general's reaction and started to move forward again. But Morrison held up his hand once more, this time more forcefully. His mind was racing, trying to process what he had just heard and what it could possibly mean. How could this young recruit know that name? How could she know about something that happened so long ago in a place so far from here? Sarah straightened back to attention, her brief moment of vulnerability replaced once again by that same calm intensity. She had taken an enormous risk by revealing what she knew, and now there was no going back. The secret she had carried for years was finally out in the open, and she could only wait to see how the general would react. The other recruits in the formation remained frozen, sensing that something significant was happening, but having no idea what it could be. They had expected to witness a simple disciplinary action, perhaps seeing their fellow recruit receive punishment for her disrespectful behavior. Instead, they found themselves witnessing something that felt much more personal and complex. General Morrison took a step closer to Sarah, his voice dropping so low that only she could hear him. "Where did you hear that name?" The question carried the weight of decades of buried memories and carefully guarded secrets. His hands, which had remained steady through countless battles and difficult decisions, began to tremble slightly. Sarah met his gaze directly, no longer the anonymous recruit in a sea of uniforms. "My grandmother told me about you," she said quietly. "She told me about David Liu." The name hit the general like a physical blow. David Liu. A name from a different life, a different war, a different version of himself that he thought he had left behind forever. Suddenly, he was no longer standing on a military base in the present day. He was back in the jungles of Vietnam, young and terrified, depending on the kindness of strangers to survive. Sarah slowly raised her hand and returned the general's salute, completing a circle that had been left open for 3 decades. In that moment, both of them understood that this was more than a military gesture. It was an acknowledgement of the debt that could never truly be repaid, a connection that transcended the boundaries of nationality, rank, and time itself. The other recruits watched in stunned silence as their commanding general maintained his salute for much longer than military protocol required. Some of them had heard stories about Morrison's distinguished career, his battles in multiple conflicts, and his reputation as one of the most decorated officers in the military, but none of them had ever seen him display such raw emotion or personal vulnerability. After what felt like an eternity, both Morrison and Sarah lowered their hands. The general turned to address the formation, his voice carrying across the training ground with an authority that commanded immediate attention. "Soldiers, you have just witnessed something that cannot be taught in any military academy or found in any training manual. You have seen the power of honor, sacrifice, and remembrance." He paused, looking at each face in the formation before continuing. Private Chen's grandmother was a woman named Chen Li, who lived in a small village in Vietnam during the war. She saved the lives of 4 American soldiers, including myself, at great personal risk to herself and her family. She asked for nothing in return except that we remember her kindness and carry it forward. The drill sergeant, who had been frozen in confusion for several minutes, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I continue with the inspection?" His question hung in the air, highlighting the absurdity of returning to routine military procedures after such an extraordinary revelation. Morrison shook his head. "Cancel the inspection, Sergeant. I need to speak with Private Chen privately." He turned to Sarah, his expression mixing military authority with personal warmth. "Would you walk with me, Private?" They walked away from the formation, leaving behind the confused whispers and curious stares of the other recruits. Morrison led Sarah to a quiet area near the base chapel, where they could speak without being overheard. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows and warming the air around them. "Tell me about your grandmother's last years," Morrison said, settling onto a wooden bench beneath a large oak tree. I need to know if she lived a good life after the war. Sarah sat beside him, her military bearing relaxing for the first time since their encounter began. She lived to be 91 years old. After the war ended, she moved to America through a refugee program. She worked in a laundry for 20 years, sending money back to Vietnam to help rebuild the village. She learned English, became a citizen, and raised 3 children as a single mother. Morrison listened intently, absorbing every detail about the woman who had shaped his understanding of human nature. She never married again? No, Sarah replied. She said she had given her heart to her first husband and her son, and losing them both to war had taught her that some kinds of love are too precious to risk twice. But she was happy. She had a small apartment filled with plants and pictures of her family. She cooked traditional Vietnamese food for the neighborhood children and told stories about the old country. The general felt a mixture of sadness and relief. He was sorry that Chen Li had experienced such loss and hardship, but grateful that her later years had been peaceful. Did she ever speak about being angry? About what the war took from her? Sarah considered the question carefully. She said anger was like carrying hot coals in your pocket. It burns you more than anyone else. She chose forgiveness instead, not because she forgot what happened, but because she refused to let hatred poison the rest of her life. She said that saving you and your men had given her son's death some meaning. Morrison felt his throat tighten with emotion. The wisdom and strength of this woman continued to amaze him even decades after their brief encounter. I tried to find her, you know. I spent years searching, hoping to thank her properly, to help her family if they needed anything. She knew you would try, Sarah said with a small smile. She said Americans always want to fix things, to make everything even. But she didn't save you because she wanted payment or recognition. She saved you because it was the right thing to do. She said the best way to thank her was to live a life worthy of her sacrifice. The weight of those words settled heavily on Morrison's shoulders. He thought about his military career, his rise through the ranks, the decisions he had made that affected thousands of lives. Had he lived up to Chen Li's sacrifice? Had he honored her memory through his actions? I have a confession to make, Morrison said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. That experience with your grandmother changed everything about how I approach military leadership. Every difficult decision I've made, every time I've had to choose between following orders and doing what's right, I've thought about her. She showed me that true strength comes from compassion, not from power. Sarah turned to face him more directly. She would be proud to hear that. She always said that the young soldier she helped had kind eyes, even when he was scared and far from home. She believed that people with kind eyes could change the world if they were given the chance. Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather journal that he had carried with him for years. I've been keeping a record of the people I've tried to help throughout my career. Officers I've mentored, soldiers I've advocated for, policies I've changed to make military life more humane. I started this journal the day I got back from Vietnam, and I've always thought of it as my letter to your grandmother. He opened the journal and showed Sarah pages filled with names, dates, and brief descriptions of acts of kindness and leadership. There were stories about young soldiers he had helped through difficult times, families he had assisted after military tragedies, and reforms he had championed to improve military health care and education programs. This is beautiful, Sarah said, carefully turning the pages, but you don't owe her anything more. She would say you've already paid her back 1,000 times over. Morrison closed the journal and looked out across the military base, watching young soldiers going about their training and duties. Maybe, but I owe her something else now. I owe it to her memory to make sure her story is told, to make sure people understand what real heroism looks like. He turned to Sarah with a new sense of purpose in his eyes. How would you feel about helping me write a book about your grandmother? Not just the story of how she saved us, but the story of her whole life. The world needs to hear about people like Chen Li, people who choose love over hatred even in the darkest times. Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. I have boxes of her letters, photographs, and journals. She documented everything, hoping that someday her story might help people understand that enemies are often just friends who haven't met yet under the right circumstances. Over the following weeks, General Morrison found himself completely absorbed in learning about Chen Li's extraordinary life. Sarah had arranged to bring her grandmother's belongings to the base, and Morrison spent his evenings poring over photograph albums, reading translated letters, and listening to Sarah's stories about the woman who had saved his life so many years ago. The collection of memorabilia, painted a picture of a life lived with remarkable grace, despite enormous hardship. There were letters Chen Li had written to relatives still in Vietnam, describing her struggles to learn English and adapt to American culture. There were photographs of her working in the laundry, always smiling despite the obvious fatigue in her eyes. There were certificates from citizenship classes, English language courses, and community service organizations where she had volunteered her time. One evening, as Morrison sat in his office examining a particularly faded photograph, Sarah knocked on his door. She carried with her a small wooden box that looked like it had been crafted by hand many decades ago. "I saved this for last," Sarah said, placing the box carefully on Morrison's desk. "Grandmother said this was the most important thing she owned, and that I should only share it with you if I ever found you." Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he opened the box. Inside, nestled in a piece of faded silk, were his own dog tags from Vietnam. They were tarnished with age but still readable, bearing the name David Liu and his service number. Beneath the dog tags was a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with time. Sarah helped him unfold the paper carefully, revealing a letter written in Vietnamese with an English translation attached in Chen Li's careful handwriting. The letter was addressed to the young American soldier with kind eyes. Morrison read the letter aloud, his voice breaking several times as he struggled with the emotion of the words. "My dear young friend, if you are reading this, it means my granddaughter has found you and kept the promise I made to myself when you left our village. I want you to know that helping you and your friends was not a burden or a sacrifice. It was a gift that you gave to me, the chance to show that love is stronger than war, that kindness can cross any boundary. I know you will carry guilt about the things you may have to do as a soldier. War asks impossible things of young people, and then expects them to live with the consequences. But remember that you also have the power to choose compassion, to see the humanity in every person you encounter, whether they wear your uniform or another. My son died fighting for what he believed was right. You were fighting for what you believed was right. Perhaps you were both right, or perhaps you were both wrong. I do not have the wisdom to judge such things. What I know is that both of you were young men far from home, scared and brave at the same time, trying to survive something bigger than yourselves. I have kept your dog tags not as a trophy or a memory of war, but as a reminder that even in the darkest times, people can choose to help each other. When I look at them, I remember that there are good people on all sides of every conflict, and that hope always exists if we are brave enough to look for it. Live a good life, my young friend. Make choices that honor not just your own country and family, but the shared humanity that connects all people. Be a leader who remembers what it feels like to be lost and afraid, and use that memory to guide others with kindness. If we never meet again in this world, know that you carry my love and prayers with you always. You are part of my family now, connected to us by bonds stronger than blood or nationality. When your time comes to leave this world, you will not go alone. My spirit and the spirits of all those who loved you will be waiting to welcome you home. With endless gratitude and affection, Chen Li Morrison sat in silence for several minutes after finishing the letter, tears flowing freely down his face. The weight of 30 years of wondering and searching had finally been lifted, replaced by a profound sense of peace and connection. "She wrote this letter 3 months before she died," Sarah said softly. "She made me promise to memorize every word in case the paper was lost or damaged. She said it was the most important thing she would ever write." Morrison carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the box with his dog tags. "I need to ask you something, Sarah, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Your grandmother's story deserves to be told to the world, but sharing it will mean giving up your privacy. People will want to interview you, to hear about your family's experience. Are you prepared for that?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. Grandmother always said that stories have power, but only if they are shared. She lived through one of the most terrible wars in history, but she found a way to create something beautiful from that experience. If her story can help other people choose love over hatred, then sharing it is not a sacrifice. It's an honor. Morrison stood up and walked to the window of his office, looking out at the training grounds where young soldiers were practicing their drills. "I've been thinking about something your grandmother wrote in her letter. She said that good people exist on all sides of every conflict. That's not a popular idea in military circles, where we're trained to think in terms of us versus them." He turned back to Sarah, his expression thoughtful. But what if she was right? What if the real enemy isn't the people wearing different uniforms, but the hatred and fear that make us unable to see each other's humanity? What if the goal isn't to defeat other people, but to defeat the circumstances that make conflict seem necessary? Sarah smiled, recognizing her grandmother's influence in Morrison's words. She used to say that soldiers are often the people who understand peace best, because they've seen the cost of war up close. She said that real military strength comes from preventing conflicts, not just winning them. Morrison felt a new sense of purpose forming in his mind. I want to do more than just write a book about your grandmother. I want to create a foundation in her name, something that brings together veterans from different sides of conflicts to share their stories and work for peace. If Chen Li could see past uniforms and nationalities to help her supposed enemies, then maybe we can teach others to do the same. The idea energized both of them as they began to discuss the possibilities. They could create scholarships for students studying conflict resolution, fund programs that brought together former enemies to work on humanitarian projects, and develop educational materials that taught young people about the human cost of war. Grandmother would love this idea, Sarah said, her excitement evident. She always believed that understanding each other's stories was the first step toward peace. She said that when you know someone's name, their family, their dreams and fears, it becomes much harder to hate them. Morrison picked up his phone and began making notes about people he could contact to help launch such a foundation. Military colleagues who had served in different conflicts, peace organizations, educational institutions, and humanitarian groups all came to mind as potential partners in this endeavor. As the evening wore on, Morrison and Sarah found themselves planning not just a book and a foundation, but a movement that could honor Chen Li's memory by spreading her message of compassion and understanding to future generations. The young recruit who had refused to salute that morning had unknowingly set in motion something that could change countless lives. 6 months later, General Morrison found himself standing in front of a packed auditorium at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., preparing to announce the launch of the Chen Li Foundation for Peace and Understanding. The room was filled with military officials, peace activists, journalists, and politicians, all drawn by the extraordinary story that had begun with a recruit's refusal to salute. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her dress uniform with pride. She had been promoted to sergeant and had become Morrison's primary partner in developing the foundation. Beside her sat several other special guests, including the 3 soldiers who had been with Morrison in Vietnam and whom they had successfully tracked down through military records. Ladies and gentlemen, Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. 6 months ago, I thought I was conducting a routine inspection of new recruits. Instead, I experienced something that reminded me why we serve, and more importantly, whom we serve. He went on to tell the full story of Chen Li, from that first encounter in the Vietnamese village to the letter that had waited 30 years to be delivered. The audience listened in rapt attention, many wiping away tears as Morrison described the grandmother's final message and the profound impact it had on his understanding of leadership and service. Chen Li taught me that the strongest military force in the world is compassion, Morrison continued. She showed me that real victory doesn't come from defeating our enemies, but from transforming them into friends. The Chen Li Foundation will work to honor her memory by bringing together veterans from all sides of conflicts to share their stories and work together for peace. The Foundation's first major project was already underway. Working with the Vietnamese government and several American veteran organizations, they had organized a joint humanitarian mission to Chen Li's original village. American and Vietnamese veterans would work together to build a school and medical clinic, demonstrating that former enemies could become partners in creating something positive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a conflict resolution specialist from Georgetown University, who had joined the Foundation's board, stood up to announce the next phase of their work. We're launching an educational program called Stories Beyond Uniforms that will visit high schools and colleges across America. Veterans from different conflicts will share their experiences and teach young people about the human cost of war and the possibility of peace. The program would pair American veterans with former adversaries from Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. Together, they would tell their stories not as propaganda for any particular viewpoint, but as honest accounts of what war really costs and what peace really requires. Sarah took the podium next, Speaking for the first time publicly about her grandmother's legacy, my grandmother used to say that every war ends with someone's grandmother crying over someone's son or daughter. She believed that if those grandmothers could sit down together and share their grief, they would find ways to prevent the next war from starting. She announced the Foundation Scholarship Program, which would provide funding for students from conflict zones around the world to study in America, and for American students to study abroad in countries their nations had fought. The goal was to create a generation of leaders who understood that their former enemies were simply people with different circumstances and perspectives. The response to the foundation launch was overwhelming. Donations poured in from unexpected sources, including many veterans who had been touched by Chen Li's story. Military families sent letters sharing their own experiences of kindness from supposed enemies, revealing that Chen Li's story was part of a much larger pattern of human decency that persisted even in the worst circumstances. One particularly moving letter came from Colonel Maria Santos, a veteran of the Iraq War. She wrote about an Iraqi doctor who had risked his life to treat wounded American soldiers, and how that experience had changed her understanding of courage and patriotism. She wanted to contribute to the foundation and help find that doctor so they could work together on medical aid projects. Another letter arrived from Staff Sergeant Robert Kim, who had served in Afghanistan. He described an elderly Afghan man who had hidden him from Taliban fighters for 3 days, feeding him and caring for his wounds while enemy forces searched the area. Like Morrison, Kim had spent years trying to find his savior, and the Chen Li Foundation offered him hope that such connections could be rebuilt. As the weeks passed, Morrison and Sarah found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Military academies began incorporating Chen Li's story into their ethics curricula, teaching future officers that strength and compassion were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true leadership. International organizations took notice as well. The United Nations invited Morrison to speak about the Foundation's work at a conference on post-conflict reconciliation. NATO requested that the Foundation develop training materials for peacekeeping forces, helping them understand how to build trust with local populations in unstable regions. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Vietnam itself. The Vietnamese government, impressed by the Foundation's work, offered to provide full support for American veterans who wanted to return to Vietnam, to meet with former adversaries and work on joint humanitarian projects. Morrison received a personal letter from General Nguyen Van Duc, a former North Vietnamese army officer who had fought in the same region where Morrison had been rescued by Chen Li. The letter, translated into English, expressed admiration for Chen Li's courage and invited Morrison to visit Vietnam as his personal guest. "Your Mrs. Chen Li was not unique in her kindness," General Duc wrote. Many Vietnamese families helped American soldiers during the war, just as many American soldiers showed mercy to Vietnamese civilians and prisoners. Perhaps it is time for all of us to remember these stories alongside the stories of fighting and dying. The invitation led to planning for the Foundation's most ambitious project yet, a series of reconciliation pilgrimages where veterans from both sides would return to battlefields together, not to relive old conflicts but to honor all who had suffered and to commit themselves to preventing future wars. Sarah coordinated much of this international work, using her language skills and cultural knowledge to bridge gaps between different groups. She had become not just Morrison's partner in the Foundation, but his designated successor, ensuring that Chen Li's message would continue to spread long after Morrison's own military career ended. One evening, as they worked late in the Foundation's offices, Morrison looked up from his computer to find Sarah studying the photograph of her uncle Chen Wei that had started their whole journey together. "Do you think your grandmother would approve of what we're doing?" Morrison asked. Sarah smiled, touching the glass frame gently. "I think she would be amazed that her simple act of kindness grew into something this big. But she would also remind us that the real work happens one person at a time. One conversation at a time, one choice to show mercy instead of hatred." Morrison nodded, understanding that their work was just beginning. Chen Li's legacy would ultimately be measured not by the size of their foundation or the number of people they reached, but by the individual moments when someone chose compassion over conflict, when someone saw past uniforms and nationalities to the shared humanity underneath. 2 years after that first encounter on the military base, General Morrison stood in a small village in Vietnam, surrounded by American and Vietnamese veterans who had come together to dedicate the Chen Li Memorial School and Medical Clinic. The building was simple but beautiful, constructed with materials and labor donated by both countries working in partnership. Sarah stood beside him, now a lieutenant colonel and the executive director of the Chen Li Foundation. She had spent the past year living in Vietnam, learning more about her grandmother's early life and building relationships with local communities. Her fluency in both languages and cultures had made her an invaluable bridge between the two nations. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, including many who had known Chen Li personally. Elderly villagers shared stories about the young woman, who had been known for her kindness even before the war, describing how she had always been the first to help families in need, whether they were struggling with illness, poverty, or displacement. Morrison was deeply moved to meet some of Chen Li's surviving relatives, including her younger sister Chen Mei, who was now 86 years old. Through Sarah's translation, Chen Mei told Morrison that Chen Li had spoken about the American soldiers many times over the years, always with warmth and hope that someday the kindness could be returned. She said that helping you proved to her that love was stronger than war, Chen Mei explained, her weathered hands grasping Morrison's as she spoke. She said that if an old woman could save enemy soldiers and turn them into friends, then anything was possible for people who were willing to try. The medical clinic was already serving patients, staffed by Vietnamese doctors working alongside American military medics who had volunteered to spend their leave time providing humanitarian service. The school was teaching children from several surrounding villages, with a curriculum that emphasized both academic excellence and peace education. But the most powerful moment of the ceremony came when Morrison and General Nguyen Van Duc, his former enemy, jointly unveiled a plaque dedicated to Chen Li's memory. The plaque, written in both English and Vietnamese, read, "In memory of Chen Li, who taught us that the strongest walls are built not to keep enemies out, but to shelter friends we have not yet met." After the ceremony, Morrison and General Duke took a private walk through the village, accompanied only by Sarah as their translator. The three of them visited the site where Chen Li's original house had stood, now marked by a small garden maintained by the local community. "I need to tell you something," General Duke said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I knew about what Mrs. Chen Li did for you and your men. Word traveled quickly through our networks, and many of our commanders were angry with her for helping American soldiers." Morrison felt his stomach tighten, worried about what this revelation might mean for his understanding of Chen Li's actions. "But I was not angry," General Duke continued. "I was proud. You see, my own mother had been helped by American doctors when she was injured in a bombing. The medics could have left her to die, but they risked their lives to carry her to safety and treat her wounds. When I heard about Mrs. Chen Li, I knew she understood the same truth my mother had learned. The enemy's uniform hides the same heart that beats in our own chest." The conversation continued for hours as the three of them shared stories about moments of unexpected humanity they had witnessed during the war. Morrison told about Vietnamese soldiers who had helped wounded Americans. General Duke described American troops who had shared their rations with hungry villagers, and Sarah translated stories from other veterans who had experienced similar acts of cross-cultural compassion. As the sun began to set over the village, they were joined by other veterans from both sides who had participated in the Foundation's reconciliation programs. Former enemies sat together, sharing meals and photographs of their families, discussing their hopes for their children and grandchildren. One of the American veterans, Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, had brought his teenage son with him on the trip. The young man listened intently as his father and a former Viet Cong soldier, named Tran, discussed their shared experiences as fathers trying to heal from the trauma of war. "I want my son to understand that war is not a video game or a movie," Torres explained to Tran through Sarah's translation. "I want him to know that the people we fought were human beings with families and dreams just like us. Maybe if enough young people understand that, they'll find better ways to solve problems than sending their children to kill each other's children." Tran nodded in agreement, then pulled out a photograph of his own grandson. "My grandson is the same age as your son. Perhaps they could be pen pals, learn each other's languages, understand each other's cultures. If the grandsons of enemies can become friends, then maybe Chen Li's dream is becoming real." As the evening progressed, Morrison found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed since that morning when Sarah had refused to salute him. The Foundation had grown beyond anything he had imagined, with chapters in 15 countries and programs that had brought together thousands of former enemies. The Stories Beyond Uniforms educational program was now active in over 300 schools across America, with plans to expand internationally. The scholarship program had sent nearly 100 students to study in countries their nations had fought, creating a network of young leaders committed to international understanding. But perhaps most importantly, the Foundation had documented and preserved hundreds of stories like Chen Li's, creating an archive of human kindness that existed alongside the traditional narratives of conflict and victory. These stories were being used by historians, peace researchers, and conflict resolution specialists to develop new approaches to preventing and ending wars. Sarah had become an internationally recognized expert on veteran reconciliation, invited to speak at conferences around the world about the psychological and social benefits of bringing former enemies together for positive projects. Her research had shown that veterans who participated in reconciliation programs experienced significant reductions in PTSD symptoms and had much higher rates of successful reintegration into civilian life. As the group prepared to return to their accommodations for the night, Morrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I need to ask you something I've been thinking about for months. Your military career is just beginning, and you could go anywhere, do anything. Are you sure you want to dedicate your life to carrying on your grandmother's legacy?" Sarah looked out over the village where her grandmother had lived and loved and made the choice that changed everything. "General, my grandmother spent 60 years carrying your dog tags and wondering if her kindness had made any difference in the world. I've had the privilege of seeing that difference grow into something that's touching thousands of lives. How could I choose anything else?" Morrison smiled, understanding that Chen Li's legacy was in capable hands. "Then I have one more request. I'm retiring from active duty next year, and I want you to take over as the Foundation's primary leader. You understand this work better than anyone, and you have the vision to take it places I never could." That night, as Morrison lay in his simple bed in the village guest house, he thought about the circle that had finally been completed. A frightened young soldier had been saved by an act of extraordinary kindness. 30 years later, that soldier had been found by the granddaughter of his savior. Together, they had created something that was helping to heal the wounds of war around the world. He picked up his phone and called his wife back in America, eager to share the day's experiences with her. As he described the ceremony, the conversations with former enemies, and the hope he saw in the young people who were being touched by Chen Li's story, he realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the defeat of enemies, but their transformation into friends. Not the end of conflict, but the beginning of understanding. Chen Li had been right all along. Love really was stronger than war, and kindness really could cross any boundary. Her simple act of mercy in a small village during a terrible war had grown into a movement that was changing how people thought about conflict, compassion, and the possibility of peace. As Morrison drifted off to sleep, he could almost hear Chen Li's voice carried on the warm evening breeze, whispering the words she had spoken to him so many years ago in a language he couldn't understand, but a love he would never forget. Her legacy would continue through Sarah, through the Foundation, and through every person who chose to see the humanity in their supposed enemies. The circle was complete, but the ripples would continue spreading for generations to come.